The small Texas town of Grapevine sits quietly on the shores of its namesake lake, a place where families gather for weekend picnics and couples take romantic strolls. It's the kind of community where everyone knows everyone, where the most exciting news is usually about the high school football team or the annual summer festival. But on a humid September morning in 2016, this peaceful lakeside haven would become the center of one of the most shocking and brutal crimes the region had ever witnessed. When the sun broke through the dense canopy of trees that morning, it illuminated something no one was prepared to see. What started as a routine call would transform into an investigation that would shake this tight-knit community to its core and reveal the terrifying reality of what happens when obsession turns deadly. The discovery at Grapevine Lake wasn't just another crime scene. It was something far more sinister, something that would challenge even the most experienced investigators and leave a trail of questions that seemed impossible to answer. The victim was a young woman with her entire future ahead of her, someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the crosshairs of a dangerous man's twisted fantasies. Jackie Vandegrift was 24 years old when her life was cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. A dedicated student at Texas Women's University, she was pursuing her passion for nutrition and wellness, driven by a genuine desire to help others live healthier lives. Those who knew Jackie described her as the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, someone with an infectious smile and an unwavering optimism about the future. Her best friend from high school remembered their bond as something special, a friendship that had weathered the storms of growing up and remained strong through college years. They called themselves Jackie Squared, a playful nickname that reflected their shared name and their inseparable connection. Jackie had always been the responsible one, the friend you could count on to make smart decisions and avoid dangerous situations. That's what made the events of September 13th so shocking. Jackie wasn't someone who took unnecessary risks or put herself in harm's way. She was cautious, intelligent, and surrounded by friends who cared about her safety. Yet somehow, on that fateful Tuesday evening, she crossed paths with someone whose dark intentions would ultimately destroy everything she had worked for and everyone who loved her. The evening started innocently enough. Jackie had ventured out to a local bar in Denton, not far from her university campus. It was a decision that seemed perfectly normal for a college student looking to unwind and maybe meet some new people. She had even posted on social media about her decision to get off dating apps and try meeting people in person instead, a choice that seemed mature and sensible at the time. What she couldn't have known was that her choice to step into that bar would put her directly in the path of Charles Dean Bryant, a man whose life was spiraling out of control following a bitter breakup with his ex-girlfriend. Bryant wasn't just any random person looking for a good time that night. He was someone consumed by rage, rejection, and a dangerous obsession that had already led to multiple arrests and restraining orders. The story of how these two people came to meet is one of tragic coincidence and deadly timing. Bryant had been frequenting bars in the Denton area, not because he lived there, but because he was stalking his ex-girlfriend who attended the University of North Texas. His presence in that particular establishment on that particular night was part of a pattern of harassment that had been escalating for weeks. When Jackie walked into the bar that evening, she had no idea she was entering a trap that had been set by someone else's broken relationship. She struck up conversations with the bartender and other patrons, displaying the friendly, outgoing personality that everyone who knew her had come to love. Among those she spoke with was Charles Bryant, a man who seemed charming enough on the surface but was harboring dark thoughts and violent intentions. The surveillance footage from that night tells a chilling story of predator and prey. Though Jackie had no way of knowing the danger she was in, The cameras captured her laughing, talking, and appearing completely at ease as she socialized with Bryant and others throughout the evening. To anyone watching, it looked like a typical night out for a young college student. Nothing more than innocent fun among strangers who had just met. But investigators would later piece together a far more sinister narrative. They believed that Bryant saw something in Jackie that reminded him of his ex-girlfriend, Caitlin Mathis, the woman who had rejected him and obtained legal protection from his increasingly erratic behavior. The physical resemblance between the two young women was striking, and experts would later theorize that this similarity may have triggered something dark and violent in Bryant's already unstable mind. As the night progressed, Jackie made what seemed like a reasonable decision at the time. When the weather turned rainy and everyone was preparing to leave, she accepted Bryant's offer of a ride. It was a choice that countless young people make every weekend, trusting in the basic decency of strangers and believing that accepting help from someone she had been talking to for hours was relatively safe. The security cameras captured their final moments together in public, showing them leaving the establishment and walking to Bryant's vehicle. Jackie appeared relaxed and comfortable, still engaged in conversation with the man who would soon become her killer. She had no way of knowing that she would never make it home that night, that her family would soon be searching desperately for answers about her disappearance. What happened next would only be revealed through painstaking police work and the eventual confession of a man who had planned and executed one of the most brutal crimes in Texas history. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of stalking, obsession, and violence that had been building for months, with Jackie becoming the innocent victim of another woman's nightmare. The discovery that would forever change multiple lives came just before dawn on September 14th. A jogger following the well-worn trail around Grapevine Lake noticed something that didn't belong among the natural landscape. What appeared to be a small burned area caught his attention, but as he moved closer, the horrific reality of what he was seeing began to sink in. Captain John Luna of the Grapevine Police Department was among the first responders to arrive at the scene. Even with years of law enforcement experience under his belt, nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in that secluded area near the water's edge. The smell hit him first, that unmistakable odor that every seasoned officer dreads encountering. Then came the visual confirmation of their worst fears. There, in what appeared to be a small blue kiddie pool, were the charred remains of a human being. The body had been so severely burned and damaged that investigators couldn't immediately determine basic facts about the victim. They didn't know if they were looking at a man or woman, an adult or child. The level of destruction was unlike anything the small-town police department had encountered before. The crime scene told a story of calculated violence and deliberate concealment. This wasn't a crime of passion that had gotten out of hand. The methodical nature of the disposal suggested someone who had planned carefully, someone who understood that fire would destroy evidence and make identification nearly impossible. The killer had chosen this remote location specifically because it offered privacy and time to carry out their gruesome work. As more investigators arrived and began processing the scene, the full scope of the horror became apparent. The victim's body had been dismembered before being burned, a detail that sent shockwaves through the tight-knit law enforcement community. This level of violence suggested someone with either extensive knowledge of anatomy or a complete detachment from human empathy. The investigation began immediately, but without being able to identify the victim, detectives were working blind. They canvassed the area for any evidence that might have survived the flames, searching through ash and debris for anything that could provide a clue about who this person was or who might have wanted them dead. Every piece of potential evidence was carefully cataloged and preserved, knowing that even the smallest detail could break the case wide open. Meanwhile, just a few miles away. Jackie's absence was beginning to worry those who knew her best. Her friends had expected to hear from her after her night out, but their calls and messages were going unanswered. This wasn't like Jackie at all. She was the type of person who stayed in constant contact with her inner circle, always checking in and making sure everyone knew she was safe. Jackie Tan, her closest friend since high school, was among the first to sense that something was seriously wrong. The two had maintained their friendship through college, supporting each other through the challenges of young adulthood and celebrating each other's successes along the way. When Jackie failed to respond to messages or show up for planned activities, Tan knew instinctively that her friend was in trouble. The search for Jackie began as a missing person case, with friends and family frantically calling hospitals, checking with mutual acquaintances, and retracing her last known whereabouts. Social media posts began circulating, asking anyone with information about Jackie's whereabouts to come forward. Her photograph appeared on local news stations as the community rallied to help find the missing student. Back at Grapevine Lake, forensic experts were working around the clock to extract any usable evidence from the crime scene. The intense heat from the fire had destroyed much of what would normally help investigators, but they pressed on, knowing that somewhere in the ashes might be the key to solving this brutal crime. Their persistence would soon pay off in an unexpected way. Fingerprints, despite the damage to the body, provided the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Through careful analysis and comparison with existing records, they were able to confirm what many had already begun to fear. The victim found at Grapevine Lake was Jackie Vandegrift, the missing nutrition student whose disappearance had mobilized an entire community. The news hit Jackie's family and friends like a physical blow. The young woman they had known and loved, someone with such promise and potential, had become the victim of an unthinkably violent crime. The confirmation of her identity transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation, raising the stakes exponentially for everyone involved. Captain Luna and his team now faced the daunting task of finding Jackie's killer. They had a victim, a crime scene, and evidence of extreme violence, but they still had no clear suspect or motive. The investigation would require them to piece together Jackie's final hours, tracking every person she had encountered and every place she had been on that fateful Tuesday night. The first major breakthrough came from witness statements and security footage from the bars Jackie had visited. Multiple people remembered seeing her talking with a man throughout the evening, someone who had seemed friendly and approachable at the time. The surveillance cameras captured clear images of Jackie and her companion, providing investigators with their first real lead in the case. As detectives began analyzing the footage and interviewing witnesses, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The man Jackie had been with wasn't just some random stranger she had met that night. He had a history, a pattern of behavior that suggested this encounter might not have been as coincidental as it first appeared. The investigation was about to uncover a web of stalking, harassment, and escalating violence that had been building for months. The security footage showed Jackie leaving the second bar with her companion, walking to his vehicle in what appeared to be normal, friendly conversation. She seemed relaxed and comfortable, trusting in someone who had spent hours earning that trust. The cameras captured what would be the last time anyone would see Jackie Vandegrift alive, a sobering reminder of how quickly a routine social interaction can turn deadly. Charles Dean Bryant's name first surfaced when investigators began running background checks on everyone who had been in contact with Jackie that night. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Bryant wasn't just another patron enjoying a night out in Denton. He was a man with a recent history of arrests, restraining orders, and increasingly erratic behavior stemming from his inability to accept the end of a relationship. The connection to his ex-girlfriend, Caitlin Mathis, immediately caught investigators' attention. Here was a man who had been arrested multiple times for stalking and harassment, someone who had demonstrated a complete disregard for legal boundaries and personal safety. The fact that he had been in Denton, near Caitlin's university, on the night Jackie disappeared was far from coincidental. As detectives dug deeper into Bryant's background, they uncovered a pattern of escalating behavior that painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control. His relationship with Caitlin had ended months earlier, but he had refused to accept her decision. Instead, he had embarked on a campaign of harassment that had terrorized the young woman and led to multiple arrests. When investigators began searching Bryant's residence, what they discovered painted a chilling picture of premeditation and calculated violence. Hidden throughout his home were items that would become crucial pieces of evidence in building their case against him. The search warrant execution revealed a collection of tools and weapons that had no innocent explanation given the circumstances of Jackie's death. Among the most damning discoveries was a large military-style knife, the kind of weapon that could easily be used for the type of dismemberment Jackie had suffered. Police also found zip ties, including the specific type that Bryant would later claim had been used during what he described as consensual activity with Jackie. The presence of these restraints in his possession raised immediate red flags for investigators who understood their potential use in controlling and harming victims. Perhaps most significantly, surveillance footage from a local Walmart showed Bryant purchasing a shovel in the early morning hours after Jackie's disappearance. The timestamp on the security cameras placed him at the store at approximately 4 in the morning, just hours before Jackie's body would be discovered at the lake. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had simply panicked after an accident, but rather the methodical actions of someone trying to cover up a deliberate crime. The most conclusive piece of physical evidence came from Bryant's backyard, where investigators discovered that a kiddie pool was missing. When they compared the dimensions and characteristics of the absent pool with the one found containing Jackie's remains, the match was undeniable. This discovery eliminated any possibility that Bryant's involvement was coincidental or that someone else had used his property to dispose of the body, as the evidence mounted against him. Bryant found himself facing interrogation by some of Texas's most skilled investigators. The initial interviews yielded little useful information, with Bryant maintaining his innocence and claiming to have no memory of the events in question. His denials were consistent but unconvincing, particularly given the overwhelming physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene and victim. Recognizing that they were dealing with someone who wouldn't crack under standard questioning techniques, authorities called in Texas Ranger Jim Holland, a specialist in interrogating suspects with complex psychological profiles. Holland had built his reputation handling some of the state's most notorious criminals, including serial killers and other violent offenders who required specialized approaches to break through their psychological defenses. Holland's strategy involved building rapport with Bryant, presenting himself as someone who understood and sympathized with the suspect's situation. Rather than adopting an adversarial stance, the experienced ranger positioned himself as almost a confidant, someone Bryant could trust with his darkest secrets. This approach required patience and psychological insight, but Holland had learned that many killers actually wanted to confess their crimes to someone who would listen without immediate judgment. Over the course of several hours, Holland gradually guided Bryant through what he called memory exercises, encouraging him to reconstruct the events of that September night, piece by piece. The technique was designed to make Bryant feel like he was helping solve the case rather than incriminating himself, a psychological manipulation that had proven effective with other dangerous criminals Holland had encountered throughout his career. Slowly, details began to emerge from Bryant's carefully constructed wall of denial. He admitted to meeting Jackie at the bar, acknowledged giving her a ride when the weather turned bad, and eventually conceded that they had gone back to his residence together. Each admission was followed by attempts to minimize his culpability, portraying himself as either a victim of circumstances or someone who had acted without malicious intent. The most disturbing revelations came when Holland pressed Bryant about what had happened between him and Jackie once they were alone together. Bryant's initial claim that nothing sexual had occurred eventually gave way to a story about consensual activity that had somehow gone tragically wrong. According to his version of events, Jackie had requested to be choked during their encounter, and the zip tie that killed her had somehow tightened on its own. Holland recognized immediately that Bryant's story was a fabrication designed to provide legal cover for what had actually been a deliberate murder. The ranger's experience with violent criminals had taught him to identify the lies that killers tell themselves and others to justify their actions. Bryant's narrative about accidental death during consensual activity was a common theme among perpetrators trying to avoid murder charges. What Bryant couldn't explain away was what happened after Jackie died. Even accepting his story about an accidental death, his subsequent actions revealed the true nature of his character and intentions. Instead of calling for help or reporting the incident to authorities, he had made the calculated decision to dismember her body and dispose of the remains in a way that would make identification and prosecution as difficult as possible. The details of how Bryant disposed of Jackie's body were almost too horrific for investigators to process. Using the knife found in his home, he had systematically dismembered her remains, showing a level of detachment from human empathy that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. He had then transported the body parts to Grapevine Lake, placed them in the kiddie pool from his backyard, and set everything on fire in an attempt to destroy all evidence of his crime. Perhaps most chilling was Bryant's apparent familiarity with the location where he disposed of Jackie's body. The remote area near Grapevine Lake wasn't chosen randomly, but was a place he had visited before with his ex-girlfriend Caitlin. Investigators theorized that returning to this location was part of Bryant's twisted psychological process, a way of connecting his crime against Jackie to his obsession with the woman who had rejected him. As more details emerged about Bryant's mental state leading up to the murder, a disturbing picture began to form of a man whose grip on reality had been slipping for months. His inability to accept Caitlin's rejection had consumed him, leading to increasingly desperate and dangerous behavior. The multiple arrests for stalking and harassment had done nothing to deter him from his obsessive pursuit, and his rage had been building toward an inevitable explosion of violence. The trial of Charles Dean Bryant began amid intense media coverage and community interest. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys who understood the gravity of bringing a killer to justice, laid out a compelling case that connected Bryant's escalating harassment of his ex-girlfriend to his brutal murder of an innocent young woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence presented to the jury painted a comprehensive picture of premeditation and extreme violence. From the zip ties and knife found in Bryant's possession to the surveillance footage showing his late-night purchase of a shovel, every piece of physical evidence pointed toward his guilt. The prosecution argued that Jackie had been targeted not for anything she had done, but because her resemblance to Caitlin had triggered Bryant's rage and desire for revenge. Defense attorneys attempted to portray the killing as a tragic accident, maintaining Bryant's story about consensual activity gone wrong. They argued that their client had panicked after Jackie's accidental death and made poor decisions about how to handle the situation. However, The extreme nature of the body's dismemberment and the calculated way it had been disposed of made their argument difficult for jurors to accept. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Charles Dean Bryant was found guilty of murder in the first degree, a decision that brought relief to Jackie's family and friends, who had waited anxiously for justice. The relatively quick deliberation suggested that the evidence against Bryant had been overwhelming and that jurors had little difficulty reaching their conclusion. Bryant was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, a punishment that reflected both the severity of his crime and the legal constraints of the Texas justice system. While some had hoped for the death penalty, the sentence ensured that Bryant would spend the majority, if not all, of his remaining years behind bars, unable to harm other innocent victims. For Caitlin Mathis, Bryant's conviction brought a measure of closure, but also ongoing anxiety about her future safety. She continues to live with the knowledge that her rejection of Bryant had somehow contributed to Jackie's death, a burden of guilt that no young woman should have to carry. The restraining orders and legal protections that had failed to stop Bryant's harassment serve as a sobering reminder of the limitations of the justice system in protecting victims of stalking and domestic violence. Jackie's family established a scholarship in her memory, ensuring that her passion for nutrition and wellness would continue to benefit future students at Texas Women's University. The scholarship serves as a positive legacy from a life cut tragically short, a way for Jackie's memory to inspire others to pursue their dreams and help their communities. The murder of Jackie Vandegrift stands as a stark reminder of how quickly a night out can turn deadly when it intersects with someone else's darkness. Her story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk beneath seemingly normal social interactions, while also highlighting the devastating ripple effects that domestic violence and stalking can have on innocent bystanders. Though justice was ultimately served, no verdict could bring back the bright, promising young woman whose life was stolen by a man consumed with rage and rejection. Jeffrey Marsalis, born in the 1970s and raised in Idaho, grew up in a state better known for its scenic mountains and ski resorts than national scandals. While not especially prominent, the Marsalis family was well regarded in the local community, appearing to be an average, stable, upper-middle-class household, quiet, tidy, and seemingly ordinary. From a young age, Jeffrey was seen as intelligent, composed, and self-assured. Teachers described him as clever, sometimes too clever, with a keen sense of observation that could inspire either admiration or suspicion. He wasn't outspoken, but he thrived on being persuasive, often taking on the role of a subtle performer. As a teenager, Jeffrey was athletic, clean-cut, and active in school organizations. He avoided trouble, maintained a clean criminal record, and always presented himself as polite to adults. His outward appearance and demeanor painted a picture of an ambitious young man, underestimated by some but clearly driven. After high school, Jeffrey pursued higher education and enrolled in nursing school. He chose a career in healthcare, a field grounded in trust and compassion, traits he effectively portrayed. He never completed an advanced degree, though his partial education helped him speak confidently about healthcare, impressing those less familiar with the field. In the early 2000s, Jeffrey moved to Philadelphia, a city full of educational institutions and professional opportunities. He rented a small apartment and began presenting himself as Dr. Jeff, weaving lies and truths together so seamlessly it was hard for others to discern reality. He constructed elaborate personas, portraying himself as a doctor, Navy officer, CIA agent, trauma surgeon, and even astronaut, tailoring his identity to suit his audience. His act was convincing, complete with props like stethoscopes, military gear, badges, NASA memorabilia, and forged documents, all reinforcing his false narratives. Jeffrey used online dating platforms like Match.com to extend his web of deception. His polished profile, featuring sharp photos and a veneer of sophistication, appealed to women seeking a successful, educated, and committed partner. He played the role flawlessly, presenting himself as the ideal match. To acquaintances, Jeffrey was a charismatic enigma. He could engage in discussions on a broad range of topics, from foreign policy to anatomy, military strategy, or romance, adjusting his charm based on his audience. He didn't come across as threatening, but rather as polished and intriguing. While he kept a low profile in public, he thrived in one-on-one interactions, where he dominated conversations and carefully controlled the narrative. Romantically, he had little trouble attracting partners. He claimed to be a doctor working at 3 of Philadelphia's top hospitals, a veteran of classified overseas missions, and a high-level intelligence operative with powerful connections in Washington. Although his stories were extravagant, his calm confidence often made people believe him. When questioned, he always had convincing explanations. Jeffrey told women he was restricted from sharing certain details due to national security concerns. His apartment featured just enough theatrics to make his stories believable: a fingerprint scanner on his computer, a CIA-themed screensaver, and files marked with terms like top secret or eyes only. To those meeting him for the first time, the combination of real-world elements and fantasy seemed plausible. However, beneath the facade, there were inconsistencies. He frequently changed jobs, showed little commitment to any single profession, and never finished his advanced education. His work history was inconsistent, but it didn't immediately raise suspicion. Jeffrey moved fluidly between social circles, blending in well enough to avoid scrutiny while standing out just enough to capture attention. When people met Jeffrey casually, they rarely noticed any discrepancies in his character. He appeared confident, successful, and composed, someone worth knowing. Women who went on dates with him often left impressed, feeling special and chosen. Jeffrey had a knack for quickly understanding people, figuring out what they wanted to hear, and delivering it. It wasn't just simple charm. It was a calculated strategy. Yet, behind his polished image, Jeffrey had no close friends and confided in no one. He was constantly on the move, reshaping his identity to fit the moment. Whether in Philadelphia or Idaho, the story was always the same: Dr. Jeff, a man with purpose, connections, and nothing that seemed worth questioning. But the truth was starkly different. Jeffrey was none of the things he claimed to be. He had no medical license, no military experience, and no credentials to support the image he meticulously curated. For years, no one saw through his act. He walked through life projecting the appearance of someone with it all together. Jeffrey controlled the narrative about himself. When women met him online, typically through Match.com, they believed him. He was polished, articulate, and educated, and low-key charming in a way that inspired trust. He didn't appear arrogant or controlling. On the contrary, he seemed caring, empathetic, and safe. But things were not as they seemed, and troubling patterns began to surface. Women who interacted with Jeffrey shared eerily similar stories. At first, he would send thoughtful messages and smoothly suggest meeting for drinks. Their first date often involved alcohol, wine, cocktails, or beer. He'd make engaging conversation, ask questions, and come across as a busy man truly invested in getting to know them. Each woman left feeling special, as though they'd been given a glimpse into his exciting, secretive life. The evening often ended with an invitation to his place or for just one more drink. Then everything went silent. All emotions stopped. Time passed, leaving behind an uneasy feeling. Many women reported waking up in an unfamiliar bed, naked, disoriented, and physically unwell. Sometimes Jeffrey was beside them. Other times, they were alone. Their clothing would be misarranged, their bodies would ache, and they'd have no memory of consenting, or even of what had happened. When they confronted him, he denied anything unusual. He would feign surprise or dismiss their concerns, saying that they had had too much to drink or that they had really been into it, and told them not to make it a big deal. Many people felt self-conscious, began to doubt themselves, tried to explain the situation, and hesitated to call the police. After all, Jeffrey was known as Dr. Jeff, a Navy veteran and trauma specialist. Who would believe otherwise about him? That all changed in 2005 when a young woman from Idaho, known as Jody, decided to speak up. Jody met Jeffrey while working at the Sun Valley Resort in Idaho, where he had relocated after initial allegations began to emerge in Philadelphia. At the resort, he worked as a security guard, not a doctor, but his lies continued. He claimed to be involved in military intelligence and hinted at a life filled with experiences most people couldn't imagine. Jody has no romantic interest in Jeffrey because she is openly gay. However, she accepts his invitation to have a drink as a friend because she believes she can trust him. That night, something went horribly wrong. After Jody left her beer unattended and later drank from it, she suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to leave, but Jeffrey insisted on walking her home. She eventually passed out. The next morning, she woke up naked in an unfamiliar room, vomiting and feeling physically violated. Her memories were fragmented, but her instincts told her something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Jeffrey acted as though nothing was wrong, calling her his little gay buddy and walking her back to her dorm. But Jody refused to ignore her intuition. She went to the hospital, contacted the police, and submitted to an abuse kit exam immediately. Unlike the women in Philadelphia, Jody had physical evidence, DNA and medical documentation that confirmed her story. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Special Victims Unit had already begun piecing together complaints against Jeffrey. Quiet investigations had started after one woman came forward months earlier. The more investigators dug, the more names emerged. Women from Match.com, as well as those he met socially, began to recount similar experiences. Over time, 21 women stepped forward, each with chillingly consistent accounts of how Jeffrey had deceived and harmed them. Detective Charlie Conway recalled the moment the pattern became evident. He said that those weren't isolated misunderstandings and that it was a clear and deliberate scheme. Evidence mounted when investigators found a spreadsheet on Jeffrey's computer titled Yearly Calendar of Women. It listed names, dates, places, and cryptic notes. A chilling record prosecutors believed documented his victims. In his Philadelphia apartment, police uncovered disturbing items: a bulletproof vest, a police baton, fake hospital IDs, medical equipment, and forged or stolen military and government documents, including Navy insignias and fake CIA credentials. Among his belongings were a fingerprint scanner and software imitating a classified government system. A framed NASA astronaut photo added to the collection of identities Jeffrey used to deceive. Victim stories followed a similar pattern. They described going on dates that ended in blackouts, waking up with no memory of what happened. Many felt trapped in shame, confusion, and disorientation. Shockingly, Some continued seeing him, caught in cycles of manipulation and trauma. Jeffrey used not just drugs, but psychological control, breaking down their ability to consent. Prosecutors have faced significant challenges. Many victims come forward months or even years after the attack, leaving behind little physical evidence, such as banned substance test results, abuse kits, or witnesses. Cases often rely heavily on victim testimony. While this testimony is reliable, it is often insufficient to meet the high standard of proof in criminal cases. The case took a turn in 2006. Jeffrey was arrested in Sun Valley, Idaho, after a woman named Jody reported him immediately. Her swift action, coupled with medical evidence from an abuse kit and visible injuries, strengthened the case against him. Authorities in Idaho collaborated with Philadelphia investigators, who were building their own case based on a pattern of accusations. When confronted, Jeffrey remained calm, denying all allegations. His defense attempted to cast him as a harmless ladies' man who was being targeted by regretful women. Prosecutors, however, focused on exposing his systematic deceit. In addition to charges of abuse and assault, Jeffrey also faced allegations of impersonating public officials, committing identity fraud, and obstructing justice. By masquerading as a doctor, soldier, or spy, he not only lured victims, but also used these personas to dominate and silence them. Meanwhile, victims began connecting with one another, forming a support network to share stories and timelines. Many said it was the first time they felt heard and validated. As Jeffrey awaited trial, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Over the years, he had meticulously planned his actions, refining his methods and keeping detailed records to avoid detection. Each victim thought she was alone, unaware of the full scope of his predation. By spring 2007, Jeffrey stood trial in a Philadelphia courtroom in one of the city's most disturbing serial abuse cases. Once regarded as a charismatic and educated professional, he is now facing charges, including abuse, from 7 separate victims. Despite this, the case posed challenges. Prosecutors had no physical evidence from the Philadelphia victims, no toxicology reports, no abuse kits, and no witnesses. What they did have were consistent, compelling testimonies from women who had never met each other, but shared the same harrowing stories. They described Jeffrey's charm, his offers of drinks, the unexplained blackouts, and waking up confused, violated, and ashamed. Assistant District Attorney Joe McGettigan built the case around this consistency, along with the damning spreadsheet found on Jeffrey's laptop. The yearly calendar of women provided names, dates, and chilling notes that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Jeffrey's fake identities, including a CIA badge, hospital IDs, and military props, used to manipulate and exploit his victims, one by one. The women testified. Many wept. Others trembled as they recounted their trauma. They spoke about sickness, helplessness, self-blame, and waking up disoriented with their clothes in disarray. Some admitted staying in touch with him afterward, explaining how psychological manipulation left them unable to confront their abuse. This emotional confusion became a focal point of the defense's argument. Defense attorney James Funt argued that all the encounters were consensual, claiming the accusers felt regret, not trauma. He highlighted the absence of timely police reports and pointed out inconsistencies in their recollections. The defense also noted the lack of medical evidence, arguing that in a case based solely on memories, doubt was unavoidable. Jeffrey sat silently in the courtroom, rarely showing emotion and occasionally smiling. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vendetta, targeted for his persona rather than his actions. His defense team insisted he never claimed to be a CIA agent or a doctor, arguing these were misunderstandings or exaggerations created by the women themselves. In March 2007, the verdict was announced. Jeffrey was acquitted of all charges except two, for which he was found guilty of abuse. His acquittal on the most serious charges shocked many, particularly the women who had risked everything to testify. While the partial conviction was a legal victory, it felt emotionally hollow. Jeffrey was released on bail. However, his legal troubles were far from over. In Idaho, Jeffrey faced a separate, much stronger case, built on physical evidence. In 2009, he was tried in Blaine County for the abuse of Jody, a 21-year-old woman who had immediately sought medical help and cooperated fully with law enforcement. This time, the prosecution had what was missing in Philadelphia: an abuse kit, DNA evidence, documented injuries, and a clear timeline. They presented expert witnesses and highlighted the consistency between Jody's account and stories told by women from the previous case. Jeffrey's history, detailed in his spreadsheet and patterns of behavior, was laid bare. Jody testified with precision, recounting the night she drank with Jeffrey, how she detected something granular in her beer, the disorientation that followed, and the terror of waking up naked beside him. Her testimony was clear, her fear undeniable. The defense once again argued that the encounter was consensual and claimed Jody had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury rejected their narrative. In 2009, Jeffrey was convicted of abuse in Idaho and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time, the justice system handed down a punishment that matched the severity of Jeffrey's crimes. Crimes many believed he had been committing for years. The courtroom in Idaho resounded with relief, a stark contrast to the frustration felt in Philadelphia 2 years earlier. Jeffrey's carefully constructed double life had crumbled. The man who once boasted about being a doctor, Navy SEAL, CIA operative, and even an astronaut, was now just another inmate. For the women who testified against him, the legal outcomes brought both vindication and lingering pain. In Philadelphia, his acquittal on the most serious charges devastated many. 21 women shared their stories, but their voices were not reflected in the final verdict. In Idaho, however, the guilty verdict and life sentence represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. For Jody, the survivor whose immediate actions and forensic evidence proved pivotal, it was more than a legal triumph, it was deeply personal. Her courage to speak out promptly and consistently made all the difference. Her case demonstrated what is possible when survivors are believed, supported, and protected by the justice system. The Jeffrey case stands as a chilling example of how image, privilege, and manipulation can allow someone to avoid accountability for years. He had no criminal record, dressed impeccably, and spoke with professionalism and authority. In a justice system often plagued by doubt and contradiction, these traits worked in his favor until they didn't. The case also reignited debates on how the legal system deals with dating abuse, especially when physical evidence is lacking. Prosecutors and victims' advocates highlighted the narrow definitions of proof and the challenges of pursuing cases where the weapon isn't a knife, but a drink. In court, women not only had to explain what happened to them, but were also scrutinized for how they reacted, how quickly they reported the crime, and whether their accounts were perfect enough to be believed. The case of Jeffrey Marsalis serves as a warning about the illusion of safety, how someone can be well-dressed, well-spoken, and still pose a threat. It underscores the cost of silence and the immense bravery required to come forward. Above all, it reminds us that predators don't always appear monstrous. Sometimes, they look like the man you met online, the one with the warm smile, whose story seemed just believable enough. Jeffrey's deception was widespread, but in the end, it wasn't enough to protect him. The morning sky churned with an ominous darkness that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in one woman's life. Crystal McDowell had no idea that August 25, 2017 would be the last day anyone would see her alive, as Hurricane Harvey barreled toward the Texas coast. Crystal made a decision that would change everything. She left her home that Friday morning, walking into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. This isn't just another missing person case. This is a story where nature's fury collided with human deception, where floodwaters would wash away evidence and complicate an investigation that already had more twists than anyone could imagine. By the time the storm passed, investigators would realize they weren't just fighting against time and weather. They were up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would be the perfect cover. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Crystal McDowell's disappearance, a case that would expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary life. 3 men would emerge as suspects. One would ultimately face justice, but the path to that courtroom would be anything but straightforward. Crystal McDowell was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Those who knew her described a woman with an infectious spirit, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life and wasn't afraid to go after it. She had built a successful career as a flight attendant, traveling the world and embracing what friends called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, Crystal had traded the skies for real estate, diving headfirst into a new chapter of her professional life. At 43, Crystal was a mother to 2 children, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. She was also navigating the complexities of post-divorce life. Her marriage to Steve McDowell had officially ended just months earlier in June 2017 after 10 years together. What many described as an amicable split had left Crystal in an unusual living arrangement. She was staying in the master bedroom of the house she had helped Steve purchase, while he had moved upstairs to a different room. It was temporary, they said, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was complete. But beneath this seemingly peaceful coexistence, there were undercurrents that few people fully understood. Crystal had recently begun dating Paul Hargrave, a local jewelry store owner. Their relationship was still new, just a few weeks old, but Crystal seemed genuinely happy. So happy, in fact, that she had posted on social media just days before her disappearance, declaring she had never been happier in her entire life. The timing of Crystal's vanishing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury. Weather forecasters were predicting catastrophic flooding, and residents across the region were making final preparations for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Grocery store shelves had been stripped bare. Gas stations were running dry. Everyone who could leave had already evacuated. Crystal, however, had chosen to stay. She had responsibilities, people who depended on her. As a newly licensed real estate agent, she had clients to consider. As a mother, she had children to protect. The storm was supposed to last several days, and Crystal wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started like any other. Crystal sent text messages to Paul, her new boyfriend. They exchanged their usual good morning pleasantries, making plans for when the storm passed. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. Paul replied to Crystal's messages, but she never responded back. At first, he assumed she was simply busy preparing for the hurricane. Everyone was scrambling to secure their homes and gather supplies, but Crystal's silence was completely out of character. She was the type of person who stayed in constant communication with the people she cared about. Her Uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old, received messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her life, her work, her children. Jeff described his niece as one of the most responsible people he had ever known. Crystal never lost contact with her family. As Friday turned into Saturday, concern began to mount. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain across southeast Texas. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was taking a direct hit. Streets were flooding, power lines were down, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult. But even accounting for the chaos of the hurricane, Crystal's complete radio silence was alarming. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to have arrived at their house on Friday morning. He claimed she had sent him a text message at 7:01 that morning, saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message suggested she might stay with him and the children, since it looked like the storm would be severe. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff became increasingly worried as Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal. He began reaching out to relatives and friends, trying to piece together Crystal's last known movements. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Multiple people told him the same thing, they just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her children needed her. The timing was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint. Hurricane Harvey was wreaking havoc across the entire region. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while simultaneously trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, yet they still showed up for work every single day, determined to find Crystal McDowell. District Attorney Cheryl Leak would later describe the challenges they faced. The flooding was so severe that normal investigative procedures became nearly impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was compromised, transportation was limited. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, law enforcement remained committed to finding Crystal. They understood something that Crystal's family already knew. Mothers don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their children need them most. As the floodwaters began to recede, investigators started to piece together a timeline of Crystal's final days. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. Though there was one complication, her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This detail would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Paul had expressed concern about the awkwardness of joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if Steve could perhaps skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal had approached Steve about not attending the cruise, and Steve's reaction had been intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he had apparently viewed as an opportunity to reconcile with Crystal. The investigation was further complicated by Crystal's extensive social circle. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she knew people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, someone who maintained friendships from every chapter of her life. This meant that investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to verify. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband who still shared a home with Crystal and seemed to harbor hopes of reconciliation. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend who had been one of the last people to see Crystal alive. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had begun to raise questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each claimed to want nothing more than to see her returned safely. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The discovery of Crystal's abandoned Mercedes in a motel parking lot would mark the beginning of the end of this tragic mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While law enforcement was struggling against flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's own family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal frequented, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. It was this intimate knowledge that led them to the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6, its doors unlocked, and keys resting conspicuously on the center console. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. In his years of law enforcement experience, he had never encountered an abandoned vehicle staged so obviously. Everything about the scene screamed setup. The car's placement seemed almost theatrical. It was positioned in plain sight, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. But whoever had left it there hadn't anticipated the massive flooding that Harvey would bring. The rising waters had trapped the Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had likely been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented unique challenges. The flood damage had contaminated potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane-related problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, yet they continued working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies began canvassing nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have captured whoever had abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was painstaking work made even more difficult by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had suffered flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline. But investigators persevered, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they discovered footage from a Shell gas station adjacent to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure emerging from what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash receptacle. The person seemed to be disposing of something, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept glancing toward the motel, as if checking to ensure the car was still where it had been left. The footage was far from perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure bore a strong resemblance to Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with. But Steve wasn't making things easy for law enforcement. When brought in for questioning, he maintained his story that Crystal had never arrived at his house that Friday morning. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to her and volunteered to help with the investigation in any way possible. His demeanor was cooperative, even friendly, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Polygraph tests were administered to both Steve and Paul Hargrave. The results were revealing. While Paul's test results were inconclusive, Steve failed his examination decisively when confronted with these results. Steve's attorney advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. The friendly, helpful ex-husband suddenly became evasive and defensive. Meanwhile, investigators were learning more about the dynamics of Crystal and Steve's relationship. What had been described as an amicable divorce was actually far more complicated. Family members revealed that Steve had never truly accepted the end of their marriage. He harbored fantasies about reconciliation and had been devastated when Crystal began dating someone else. Crystal's Aunt Cindy provided crucial insights into Steve's behavior. She described how he would cater to Crystal's every need, rubbing her feet when she was tired, brushing her hair when she asked. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Crystal's independence had been gradually eroding under the weight of his neediness. When Crystal finally decided to end their marriage, Steve's world had collapsed. The upcoming family cruise had taken on enormous significance in Steve's mind. He had apparently purchased matching white outfits for himself and Crystal, planning to propose to her during the trip. In his fantasy, they would remarry and start fresh. When Crystal uninvited him from the cruise to make room for her new boyfriend, it shattered his delusions about their future together. Financial pressures were also mounting in Steve's life. Crystal had been his primary source of financial support, and she had recently decided to cut him off. Friends described how Steve had been spending money recklessly, making purchases he couldn't afford, while Crystal covered his expenses. When she finally said she couldn't continue supporting his lifestyle, Steve faced the loss of not just his ex-wife, but his entire way of life. The investigation took another crucial turn when deputies discovered additional surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. This video showed Steve purchasing a bicycle on the day Crystal disappeared. The timing was significant because it provided a potential explanation for how Steve had gotten home after abandoning Crystal's car at the motel. The bicycle purchase occurred after Crystal's Mercedes had been spotted at the motel, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. Investigators were building a compelling circumstantial case, but they still lacked the direct evidence needed to make an arrest. Steve seemed to understand this, growing more confident and arrogant with each passing day. He would arrive at the sheriff's office for questioning and sit for hours, calmly denying any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. His attitude suggested he believed he was untouchable. The psychological pressure was mounting on all sides. District Attorney Cheryl Leek knew Steve was guilty, but struggled with the knowledge that knowing something and proving it in court were two very different challenges. The case was consuming enormous resources, and the community was demanding answers. Meanwhile, Steve retained custody of his and Crystal's two young children, a situation that made everyone uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they needed to apply different pressure to Steve. Rather than continuing to focus solely on gathering evidence, they decided to remove the children from his care. Working with Family Protective Services, they arranged for Madden and Maui to be placed with Crystal's Aunt Cindy. The psychological impact on Steve was immediate and devastating. Losing custody of the children represented Steve's final connection to his old life. Without Crystal and without the kids, he had nothing left to lose. Investigators hoped this realization would finally break through his defenses and lead to a confession. They were betting everything on the theory that a man with nothing left to protect might finally tell the truth. The gamble was risky. If Steve decided to run or harm himself, they would lose their only real suspect and any chance of finding Crystal's body. But Sheriff Hawthorne made the difficult decision to allow Steve to go home one final time, giving him the night to consider his options. It was an unprecedented move that would either solve the case or let a killer escape justice forever. The night Steve spent at home would prove to be his last as a free man. Early the next morning, he called his daughter Krista, who was attending Texas A&M University. asking her to come home immediately. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When Krista arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, she found her father in a state she had never seen before. Steve was methodical that morning, almost businesslike as he handed over photo albums, financial documents, and even the keys to his prized Mustang to Krista. It seemed like her father was simply trying to get his affairs in order before facing whatever consequences awaited him. She had defended him throughout the investigation, believing completely in his innocence. But then the conversation took a chilling turn. Steve looked at his daughter and said something that would haunt her forever. He mentioned that investigators had told him they would reduce his punishment if he revealed where Crystal's body was located. When Krista protested that he couldn't possibly know such information, Steve's response was devastating. He looked away and broke down completely. In that moment, Krista realized the horrible truth. Her father knew exactly where Crystal McDowell was because he had put her there. The man she had defended, the father she had loved and trusted, was a killer. When police arrived to take Steve into custody, Krista collapsed to her knees and wept. At the sheriff's office, Steve finally began to talk. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came nonetheless. He described how Crystal had returned home that Friday morning after spending the night with Paul. An argument had erupted immediately. Steve was furious that she had stayed out all night, devastated by her obvious happiness with another man. In his statement, Steve claimed that Crystal had become aggressive during their confrontation. He said she didn't love him anymore, that she had made that abundantly clear. But investigators believed the truth was simpler and more sinister. Steve McDowell had made a calculated decision. If he couldn't have Crystal, nobody could. The details Steve provided were horrific. He described strangling Crystal from behind, catching her completely off guard. She had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to fight back. After killing the mother of his children, Steve had methodically disposed of her body, wrapping it in trash bags before driving to a remote wooded area. Steve led investigators to the location where he had dumped Crystal's remains. The site was densely wooded and difficult to access, chosen specifically because Steve believed it would never be discovered. Recovery efforts were complicated by the thick vegetation and the decomposition that had occurred during the weeks since Crystal's murder. When Crystal's body was finally recovered, the case officially became a homicide prosecution. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with murder, ending months of speculation and bringing some measure of closure to Crystal's devastated family. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of Steve's deception and obsession. Despite his confession, he attempted to claim that Crystal's death had been accidental, the result of what he described as a spontaneous embrace that had gotten out of control. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 days of testimony and evidence, it took the jury less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. Steve McDowell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2042 when he is in his 70s. The tragedy extended far beyond Crystal's death. 2 young children had lost both parents, their mother to murder, their father to prison. 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui would grow up knowing the devastating truth about how their family had been destroyed. Crystal McDowell's story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the facade of even the most seemingly normal relationships. Her death occurred during one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. But the real storm had been brewing in her own home for years. Hurricane Harvey eventually passed, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and forever changing the Texas Gulf Coast. But for Crystal's family and friends, the storm's most devastating casualty was a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Today, Crystal's children are thriving under the care of family friends who have provided them with the stability and love they deserve. They carry their mother's memory with them, remembering her infectious spirit and her determination to always do what was right. This case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite flooded crime labs, damaged evidence, and personal losses from the hurricane, they persevered until justice was served. Crystal McDowell's story didn't end with Hurricane Harvey, but her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the children she loved more than anything in the world. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further, that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation. Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, They were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal in a breakthrough moment for the case. Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. Looking at this tragic case that shook a college community to its core, we need to examine how a promising young nursing student's life was cut short by someone she thought she could trust. Tonight, we're diving deep into the murder of Haley Anderson, a case that would span 2 countries and raise questions about justice, obsession, and the warning signs we sometimes choose to ignore. It was March 2018 when 22-year-old Haley Anderson disappeared from her off-campus apartment near Binghamton University. What started as concern among friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that would expose the dark side of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Haley Anderson embodied everything you'd expect from a dedicated nursing student approaching graduation. Her friends described her as a free spirit with an infectious energy that drew people to her. She was the type of person who trusted everyone she met, always seeing the good in people even when others warned her to be more cautious. This trusting nature would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, Haley had worked tirelessly throughout her college years to achieve her dream of becoming a nurse. By March 2018, graduation was just around the corner, and she had already secured a nursing position back home. Her mother, Karen, was planning a celebration party, excited to have her daughter close again after years of college life upstate. But Haley's plans extended far beyond that first job. She dreamed of traveling to California, buying a hippie van, and working as a traveling nurse while exploring the country. It was a plan that perfectly captured her adventurous spirit and desire for freedom. At Binghamton University, Haley had cultivated a close group of friends who became like family to her. She lived in an off-campus apartment with roommates who knew her daily routines, her habits, and most importantly, when something was wrong, among her social circle was Kevin Ocampo, her on and off boyfriend who genuinely loved her but understood that Haley wasn't ready for a serious commitment. She had made it clear that she wanted to experience freedom after graduation before settling down with anyone. It was through Kevin that Haley first encountered Orlando Tercero, a fellow nursing student who would eventually become the center of this tragic story. Orlando was born in Miami but raised in Nicaragua, coming from a well-to-do family with medical connections. His father was a physician, which likely influenced Orlando's decision to pursue nursing. By all accounts, he was a good student who worked hard during the week and enjoyed socializing on weekends. The initial meeting between Haley and Orlando happened in their nursing classes, but they didn't really connect until a party at Kevin's apartment during Haley's 4th year. Orlando and Kevin bonded over their shared Hispanic background and ability to speak Spanish, leading Kevin to invite Orlando to join his fraternity. What began as a friendship between the three of them gradually shifted into something more complicated. When Haley and Kevin took one of their breaks, Orlando crossed a line by pursuing Haley romantically. This created tension within their friend group, especially when Orlando's fraternity brothers pushed him out for getting involved with Kevin's girlfriend. The relationship between Haley and Orlando developed into its own on and off dynamic. Friends described their interactions as volatile, ranging from hysterical laughter to heated arguments. Sometimes they would avoid each other for weeks. Other times, Orlando would be staying over at Haley's apartment. But according to those closest to the situation, Haley had been crystal clear from the beginning that she didn't want a committed relationship with Orlando. She was focused on finishing school and maintaining her independence. Orlando, however, seemed to have different ideas about where their relationship was heading. Haley's roommate Josie began noticing concerning behavior from Orlando. He would show up at their apartment uninvited, sometimes just to smoke a cigarette on their porch. He would drive by their house repeatedly, and Josie often found herself in the position of having to ask him to leave because Haley found it difficult to be direct with him herself. The red flags became impossible to ignore when jealousy entered the picture. Orlando clearly struggled with the fact that Haley was seeing other people and maintaining her relationship with Kevin. His possessive behavior began escalating in ways that should have been warning signs to everyone involved. Friends described Orlando as charismatic and fun to be around, someone who knew how to make people laugh and enjoy themselves. But beneath that charm was a growing obsession with Haley that became more apparent as time went on. The situation reached a disturbing turning point when Haley's tires were slashed. It happened the day after a party at Orlando's apartment, where he learned that Haley and Kevin were back together. When Haley walked Kevin out to his car the next morning, they discovered the damage. Kevin immediately suspected Orlando, and so did Haley's mother Karen when she heard about the incident. The damage was significant, over $600 worth, which would have made it a felony charge. Despite pressure from her family to file a police report and press charges, Haley refused. She was concerned that a felony conviction would get Orlando kicked out of the nursing program. This decision perfectly illustrated Haley's compassionate nature, but it also demonstrated how Orlando had manipulated her feelings of guilt and sympathy. Friends later revealed that Orlando would often make statements about wanting to harm himself, using emotional manipulation to keep Haley involved in his life even when she tried to distance herself. Despite the tire slashing incident and the warnings from friends and family, Haley eventually allowed Orlando back into her life. Her trusting nature and genuine care for others made it difficult for her to completely cut ties with someone she had once cared about. The months following the tire incident were marked by this same pattern of Orlando's concerning behavior, followed by Haley's reluctant forgiveness. Her friends watched with growing alarm as the cycle continued. But Haley remained convinced that she could handle the situation. None of them could have predicted how deadly that situation would become. As March 2018 arrived, Haley was focused on her final semester and upcoming graduation. She had been spending time with her roommates, enjoying normal college activities like playing board games and sharing wine on quiet evenings. These were the moments that would later take on profound significance as the last peaceful memories her friends had of her. On the evening of March 7th, Haley had what would be her final normal night with her roommates. They stayed up late together, talking and laughing as college friends do. When they went to bed that night, none of them realized it would be the last time they would see Haley alive. The next morning brought an eerie silence that her roommates initially dismissed. Haley loved to sleep in, so when she didn't respond to text messages right away, no one was immediately concerned. College students often have irregular schedules, and it wasn't unusual for someone to be unreachable for a few hours. But as March 8th wore on with no word from Haley, that initial lack of concern began transforming into genuine worry. By Thursday, March 8th, when Haley failed to show up at poetry night, where she had promised to watch her friend perform, the concern among her circle intensified dramatically. Multiple attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, which was completely out of character for someone who stayed in constant communication with her friends and family. Her roommates began piecing together the timeline of the previous evening, trying to understand when they had last seen or heard from Haley. The realization that she had been missing for over 24 hours without any contact sent alarm bells ringing through their tight-knit group. Meanwhile, back in Westbury, Karen Anderson remained unaware that anything was wrong. She and Haley had an agreement that they would talk every Sunday, respecting her daughter's independence while maintaining their close relationship. It was still early in the week, so Karen had no reason to suspect that her daughter was in danger. The breakthrough in locating Haley came through modern technology and the quick thinking of her roommates. One of them remembered that Haley had shared her location through the Find My Friends app on her phone. When they checked the app, it showed that Haley's phone was at Orlando's apartment. This discovery shifted the search from a general missing person case to a focused investigation at a specific location. The roommates made the decision to go to Orlando's apartment and see if they could find their friend. When they arrived at the house where Orlando lived, they knocked on all the doors, but received no response. Orlando's car was also missing from the property, which seemed to confirm that no one was home. However, the fact that Haley's phone was showing as being inside the apartment created an urgent need to investigate further. Faced with locked doors and growing fear for their friend's safety, the roommates made the difficult decision to climb through a window to gain entry to the apartment. This wasn't a decision they made lightly, but their concern for Haley outweighed their reservations about entering someone else's home without permission. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roommate who entered first immediately screamed for the others to call 911. In Orlando's bedroom, they found Haley's lifeless body. She appeared pale and motionless, and even though they hoped against hope that she might still be alive, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The police response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the 911 call, the house was swarming with officers, investigators, and medical personnel. The scene quickly transformed from a college rental house into an active crime scene. Initial examination revealed that Haley had been strangled to death. The position of her body and the condition of the room suggested that the attack had been intimate and personal. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery, pointing towards someone she knew and trusted. Most significantly, Orlando was nowhere to be found. As investigators began processing the crime scene, they discovered a wealth of evidence that would help them piece together the timeline of events. The house was equipped with multiple security cameras that had captured movements both inside and outside the property. The camera footage revealed a chilling sequence of events that began in the early morning hours of March 8th. The first significant recording showed Haley and Orlando walking into the residence together. This would be the last time Haley was seen alive on any recording. After entering the apartment with Haley, Orlando was captured on camera leaving the residence multiple times over the following hours. However, Haley never appeared on any subsequent footage, suggesting that she never left the apartment after their initial arrival together. The timeline established by the security cameras painted a disturbing picture of Orlando's activities in the hours following Haley's death, rather than immediately calling for help or reporting what had happened. He appeared to be methodically planning his next moves. Investigators tracked Orlando's movements through various pieces of evidence found in his apartment. A receipt led them to a local pharmacy where security footage showed him purchasing sleeping aids, including Zizquil and melatonin. This purchase occurred several hours after Haley's estimated time of death, suggesting he was attempting to cope with what he had done or prepare for his own suicide. The evidence suggested that Orlando returned to his apartment after the pharmacy visit and remained there for approximately 7 more hours. During this time, investigators believe he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself in the basement of the house. Physical evidence supported this theory. Officers found blood on the basement floor and a tie hanging from a doorway, along with hooks that could have been used in a suicide attempt. It appeared that Orlando had tried to hang himself but had fallen and injured himself in the process, explaining the blood evidence. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten note found in the apartment, written in Spanish. The note began with "Lamento mucho esto," which translates to "I'm really sorry about this." Orlando continued by writing that he never felt he could be capable of doing such a thing, and ended with "Father, I'll see you soon," a reference to his deceased father. This note served as both a confession and what appeared to be a suicide note, providing investigators with clear evidence of Orlando's guilt and his mental state following the crime. However, instead of following through with his apparent suicide plan, Orlando made a different choice. Approximately 16 hours before Haley's body was discovered by her roommates, security cameras captured Orlando leaving his apartment one final time, this time carrying luggage, with his head bandaged, likely from his failed suicide attempt. Orlando drove more than 3 hours to New York's JFK Airport. There, he boarded a plane that would take him back to his home country of Nicaragua, where he held dual citizenship. This flight represented Orlando's attempt to escape justice by fleeing to a country where extradition would prove complicated. His dual citizenship status meant that Nicaragua was not required to send him back to the United States to face charges, creating a potential legal nightmare for prosecutors. When District Attorney Steve Cornwell learned that Orlando had successfully fled to Nicaragua before they could arrest him, his first thought was the devastating possibility that a killer might have escaped justice permanently. The complexities of international law and extradition treaties meant that bringing Orlando back to face trial would be far from guaranteed. The case now required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international cooperation, and navigation of complex legal frameworks that many local prosecutors rarely encounter. What had begun as a local murder investigation was about to become an international pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, the devastating news of Haley's death reached her family in the most heartbreaking way possible. Karen Anderson was at home when she noticed two men in a black car parked outside her house. When they approached her door and asked to speak with her, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The officers sat her down and delivered the news that no parent ever wants to hear. They told her that Haley had been found dead, that she had been strangled, and that the primary suspect had fled the country. In that moment, Karen's world completely collapsed. The guilt and regret hit her immediately. She remembered the tire slashing incident and her insistence that Haley should have pressed charges against Orlando. She wondered if her daughter would still be alive if they had taken that threat more seriously, if they had recognized the warning signs for what they truly were. The international hunt for Orlando Tercero intensified as Nicaraguan authorities worked to locate the fugitive. Within days of his flight from New York, Orlando was tracked to his hometown of Chinandega, Nicaragua, where he had been hiding with family members. The political climate in Nicaragua complicated matters, but eventually, local police apprehended him at a hospital where he was receiving treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. A dramatic press conference in Managua showcased Orlando in custody, confirming to the world that he had been captured. However, capturing him was only the beginning of what would become a prolonged legal battle spanning two countries and two very different justice systems. District Attorney Cornwell initially pushed for extradition, hoping to bring Orlando back to New York to face second-degree murder charges. For over a year, diplomatic channels worked to secure his return, but the dual citizenship issue proved insurmountable. Nicaragua's constitution prohibited extraditing its own citizens, regardless of existing treaties with the United States. In September 2019, Cornwell received the call that would change everything. The Department of Justice delivered mixed news. Nicaragua would not extradite Orlando, but they were willing to prosecute him under their own legal system. While this wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, it represented Haley's family's only chance at seeing some form of justice. The charges in Nicaragua were different from what Orlando would have faced in New York. Instead of second-degree murder, he was charged with femicide, a specific crime recognizing the murder of women by men with whom they had relationships. This charge carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. What followed was an unprecedented legal proceeding that would test the limits of international cooperation. The entire trial was conducted through video conferencing, with witnesses testifying from the Broome County District Attorney's Office to a courtroom in Managua, thousands of miles away. Karen Anderson became the first witness, finally coming face to face with her daughter's killer through a computer screen. The technology allowed her to see Orlando's reaction as she testified about the warning signs they had all witnessed, his possessive behavior, and the devastating impact of losing Haley. One by one, Haley's friends and roommates shared their stories with the Nicaraguan court. They described Orlando's obsessive behavior, the tire-slashing incident, and his pattern of showing up uninvited at their apartment. The surveillance footage from Orlando's house was presented as evidence, showing the timeline of events that led to Haley's death. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing that Haley had died from strangulation, with specific injuries consistent with manual compression of her neck. The intimate nature of the attack reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of passion committed by someone Haley knew and trusted. Orlando's defense team argued that he had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, claiming he had no memory of the events due to alcohol consumption. They brought in a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that Orlando claimed to have woken up after a night of heavy drinking to find Haley dead. However, this defense strategy fell apart under scrutiny. There was no evidence that Orlando had been intoxicated to the point of temporary insanity, and the deliberate nature of his actions afterwards suggested clear thinking and planning. The handwritten note he left behind demonstrated his awareness of what he had done. The trial moved swiftly by Nicaraguan standards, concluding after just a few days of testimony. When the judge returned from deliberation after only 90 minutes, everyone was surprised by the speed of the decision. The verdict was unequivocal, guilty of femicide. In her sentencing remarks, the judge delivered a powerful statement about violence against women and the importance of recognizing femicide as a serious crime. She noted that Orlando had taken it upon himself to punish Haley for rejecting him, attempting to control her through the ultimate act of violence. Orlando received the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure to Haley's family and friends. While nothing could bring Haley back, seeing her killer held accountable provided a sense that justice had been served. The case established important precedents for international cooperation in domestic violence cases and highlighted the serious nature of femicide as a distinct crime. It also demonstrated how modern technology, from security cameras to phone tracking apps, can provide crucial evidence in solving murders. For Haley's family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but the beginning of another focused on healing and honoring her memory. They established initiatives to raise awareness about domestic violence warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. Karen Anderson became an advocate for femicide legislation in the United States, hoping that Haley's story might help prevent similar tragedies. She spoke openly about the guilt she carried for not pushing harder for charges after the tire-slashing incident, hoping other families might learn from their experience. The friends who discovered Haley's body continue to carry the trauma of that day, but they also carry forward her memory through their own nursing careers and advocacy work. They remember her as the free-spirited, trusting person who saw good in everyone, even when that trust ultimately betrayed her. Orlando remains imprisoned in Nicaragua's overcrowded penitentiary system, where he will likely spend the next 3 decades. If he ever attempts to return to American soil, he still faces second-degree murder charges in New York State, ensuring that his debt to justice extends far beyond his current sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence warning signs should never be ignored. That obsessive behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones who pose the greatest danger. Haley Anderson's story is ultimately one of a bright future stolen by someone who couldn't accept that love cannot be forced or controlled. Her legacy lives on through the lives she would have saved as a nurse, the awareness her case has raised about femicide, and the determination of those who loved her to ensure that her death has meaning beyond the senseless act that ended her life. In a quiet military town along California's coast, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Louise Day simply vanished without a trace. But this wasn't your typical missing person case. For over 20 years, nobody even knew she was gone. The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had just become president. MTV launched its first broadcast, and in the small town of Seaside, California, a young girl was about to disappear from existence entirely. Not just physically, but from all records, all memories, all traces of her life. What makes Mary Day's case so haunting isn't just that she vanished. It's that her own family never reported her missing. They never called the police, never filed a report, never even told the neighbors. For 2 decades, it was as if Mary Louise Day had never existed at all. This story begins not in 1981, but in 2002, when a woman named Sherry Calgaro walked into the Seaside Police Department with a question that would unravel one of the strangest missing person cases in California history. Sherry was looking for her sister Mary, who had disappeared when Sherry was just 10 years old. Detective Joe Bertina took the case, expecting it to be routine. Missing persons cases from the 80s were challenging, but not impossible. What he discovered instead was something far more disturbing. There was no record of Mary Louise Day anywhere. No social security activity, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records, nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. But the real mystery wasn't just where Mary had gone. It was why her own mother and stepfather had never bothered to look for her. The Day family had never been stable. Mary, along with her sisters Kathy and Sherry, had bounced between foster homes throughout their childhood. Their mother, Charlotte, struggled to care for them, and the girls were frequently separated. Eventually, Charlotte married William Hoole, a military man stationed at Fort Ord, and the family seemed to settle into a more permanent arrangement. But underneath the surface of this military family, something dark was brewing. Sherry remembered visiting her birth family years after Mary's disappearance, eager to reconnect with her sisters. When she asked about Mary, the response was chilling. Her sister Kathy pulled her aside and whispered urgently, telling her they weren't allowed to talk about Mary. The family had been instructed never to mention her name again. According to Sherry and Kathy, their parents had simply told them that Mary had run away. But running away was one thing. Never being reported missing was quite another. Detective Bertina began piecing together Mary's final days through interviews with her surviving family members. What emerged was a picture of an increasingly volatile household, where Mary seemed to be bearing the brunt of her stepfather's anger. The last time anyone remembered seeing Mary alive was during what appeared to be an ordinary evening at the family's home in Seaside. The family had gone out, leaving Mary and young Kathy at home alone. When they returned, they discovered their dog was sick and dying in the kitchen. William Hoole immediately accused Mary of poisoning the animal. According to Kathy's recollection, he flew into a rage, striking Mary so hard that blood ran from her mouth. That was the last time Kathy saw her sister alive. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to William and Charlotte, Mary simply ran away sometime during the night. They claimed she had done it before, so they weren't particularly concerned. But there were details that didn't add up. If Mary was a habitual runaway, why did William and Charlotte panic when they first discovered she was gone? Why did they never file a police report? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did they continue collecting Mary's Social Security benefits long after she disappeared? As Detective Bertina dug deeper into the case, he discovered that the family had been receiving monthly checks due to Mary's biological father's death in an accident. These payments continued for years after Mary vanished, suggesting that her disappearance might have been financially motivated. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Bertina decided to search the family's former home in Seaside. He brought Kathy along, hoping her childhood memories might provide clues about what had happened to her sister. Kathy led detectives to a specific area of the backyard, where she remembered being forbidden to play. According to her recollection, William had explicitly told the children to stay away from one particular corner of the yard after Mary disappeared. When cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, they immediately alerted to that exact spot. The handlers were confident that human remains had been buried there at some point. Investigators began digging, their hearts pounding as they imagined finally finding Mary's body. Instead, they found something else entirely. A small child's shoe, buried in the dirt where the dogs had indicated the presence of human remains. But there was no body. The dog handlers were puzzled but certain. Their animals didn't make mistakes like this. If they had alerted to human remains, then human remains had definitely been there. The only explanation was that the body had been moved. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. Detective Bertina was now convinced that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that her body had been buried in the family's backyard before being relocated to an unknown location. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The family's refusal to report Mary missing, their continued collection of her Social Security benefits, the forbidden area of the backyard, and the cadaver dog's alert all painted a picture of a cover-up that had lasted more than 20 years. But just as the case seemed to be building toward arrests, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about Mary Louise Day. In November 2003, police in Phoenix, Arizona, made a routine traffic stop. The vehicle had stolen plates, and when officers ran identification checks on the passengers, one name jumped out at them immediately. The woman sitting in that truck claimed to be Mary Louise Day. The news from Phoenix hit Detective Bertina like a lightning bolt. After months of building a murder case, after bringing in cadaver dogs and digging up backyards, after interviewing family members who seemed to be hiding a terrible secret, a woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day had just materialized 700 miles away. But the timing was more than suspicious. This woman had obtained her Arizona identification card just 3 weeks earlier, right in the middle of the active homicide investigation. It was as if someone had been watching the case unfold and decided to take action. When Bertina flew to Phoenix to meet this mysterious woman, he found someone who looked like she could be Mary Day. She was the right age, had similar features, and seemed to know basic details about the family. But something felt off about her story. The woman, who Bertina began calling Phoenix Mary in his reports, claimed she had run away from home as a teenager and had been living under the radar ever since. She said she had survived by using fake names and staying off the grid, which would explain why there were no official records of her existence for over 20 years. But when Bertina pressed her for details about that final night in Seaside, her memories seemed foggy and inconsistent. She remembered some kind of confrontation with William, and she recalled bleeding. But she couldn't remember anything about the sick dog that Kathy had described in such vivid detail. This was troubling to investigators. The dog incident was central to Kathy's account of Mary's final hours. If this woman was really Mary, how could she forget such a traumatic event? Phoenix Mary seemed increasingly frustrated with the questioning. During one phone conversation, she challenged the detective directly, asking how he would be able to prove who she was even if he found her body. It was an odd thing to say, and it only deepened Bertina's suspicions. The detective was convinced this woman was an imposter, but he needed proof. The solution was simple enough: a DNA test that would definitively determine whether she was Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. Bertina was confident the test would expose the deception. There was no way this woman's DNA would match Charlotte's, except it did. The results came back positive. Phoenix Mary was indeed Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. The case was officially closed, and after more than 20 years, Mary Louise Day had apparently been found alive. But for many people involved in the investigation, the DNA results only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Sherry Calgaro, eager to reconnect with her long-lost sister, invited Phoenix Mary to move in with her. Finally, after decades of wondering what had happened to Mary, the family could be reunited. Yet, almost immediately, Sherry began noticing things that didn't seem right. The woman claiming to be her sister spoke with a pronounced Southern accent, which seemed strange considering Mary had spent her childhood moving between California and various military bases. Phoenix Mary also claimed she had abandoned her real name years ago and had been going by Monica Devereaux. Sherry found magazines in the house addressed to this name, which seemed to support the story. But there were other details that bothered her. The woman didn't remember their father's inheritance, money that all the Day children were supposed to collect when they turned 18. This had been their shared dream as children, their ticket to freedom from the troubled household. How could Mary have forgotten something so important, even more unsettling? She didn't remember the secret code word that she and Sherry had shared as children. They had called it Mohawk, and it was supposed to be their special signal if they ever needed to find each other again. Kathy, Mary's other sister, had an even stronger reaction when she met Phoenix Mary. Her gut instinct told her immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister she remembered. The situation became even more bizarre when Phoenix Mary sent an email to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity. She seemed to be suggesting that she wasn't really Mary Day after all. Despite these red flags, the case remained officially closed. The DNA evidence was considered conclusive, and there didn't seem to be any compelling reason to reopen the investigation. But the story was far from over. In 2008, Steve Cercone, now Seaside's police chief, received another unexpected phone call. Investigators at Fort Ord, the former military base where the Hoole family had lived, were conducting an unrelated search with cadaver dogs when they made a startling discovery. The dogs had alerted to another location where the Hoole family had lived, a house they had moved to shortly after Mary's disappearance. Once again, the dogs indicated that human remains had been present at the site. This suggested something even more disturbing than investigators had previously imagined. Had Mary's body been moved not once, but twice were the Hooles systematically relocating evidence as they moved from base to base. Cercone felt compelled to reopen the investigation, even though the case had been officially closed. Too many questions remained unanswered. He hired Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective from nearby Salinas, to take a fresh look at all the evidence. Clark's review of the case files convinced him that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981, and that Phoenix Mary was an elaborate imposter. He developed a theory that seemed to explain all the inconsistencies, though he admitted it was somewhat far-fetched. Clark believed that Charlotte Hoole had given birth to another daughter years before Mary, a child she had given up for adoption and kept secret from the rest of the family. When the murder investigation began heating up in 2003, Clark theorized William and Charlotte had reached out to this secret daughter and convinced her to assume Mary's identity. The motive, according to Clark, was the inheritance money that Mary would have been entitled to collect. By that time, with accumulated interest, the sum had grown to approximately $60,000. This theory would explain Phoenix Mary's southern accent if she had been raised in a different part of the country. It would explain why she didn't remember family secrets or important details from Mary's childhood. And it would explain the convenient timing of her appearance, just as the murder investigation was gaining momentum. Clark also pointed to William Hoole's own words during his police interview. The stepfather had come tantalizingly close to confessing, saying that while he hadn't killed Mary, the demon inside him might have done it. In Clark's opinion, this was as close to an admission of guilt as they were likely to get. The retired detective believed that William and Charlotte had torn up Mary's pictures, thrown away her clothes, and told their other children never to speak her name again because they were covering up a murder. The fact that they had continued collecting her Social Security benefits for years only strengthened his conviction that this was a premeditated crime. But Clark's theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. He had no concrete proof that Phoenix Mary was an imposter, and the DNA evidence seemed to contradict his hypothesis. The case remained in limbo, officially closed, but unofficially still generating doubts and questions among those who had worked on it. In 2017, a new detective took charge of the Mary Day case. Detective Judy Veloz approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to separate fact from speculation. She wasn't interested in theories or hunches. She wanted hard evidence. Veloz began by re-examining the physical evidence that had convinced so many people that a murder had taken place. That child's shoe found in the backyard, for instance. When she held it in her palm, she realized it was extremely small, far too small for a 13-year-old girl of Mary's height and build. The shoe that had seemed like such damning evidence suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence. She also took a closer look at the DNA results that had closed the case in 2003. Additional testing had been conducted over the years, and the results were consistent. Phoenix Mary's DNA matched not only Charlotte Houle, but also Mary's biological father. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. But Veloz wanted to hear from Mary herself. The woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day was now living in Missouri, battling late-stage cancer. Her health was failing rapidly, and Veloz knew this might be her last chance to get answers. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and what Veloz heard convinced her that this was indeed the real Mary Day. The woman was able to fill in gaps in her story that had previously seemed suspicious. She explained that she had started calling herself Monica shortly after running away because she didn't want police to track her down and return her to William and Charlotte. Mary also introduced Veloz to a crucial figure from her past, a woman named Maury Kimmel, who had taken Mary in when she was just 15 years old. Kimmel remembered Mary as naive and childlike, someone who had clearly been through trauma but was trying to survive on her own. Kimmel's testimony helped explain many of the inconsistencies that had fueled the imposter theories. Mary had lived with Kimmel's family for about a year, one of the few stable periods in her adult life. But one day, she simply disappeared again, leaving Kimmel heartbroken and wondering what had happened to the young woman she had tried to help. The investigation revealed that Mary had spent decades moving from city to city, living on the margins of society and struggling with alcoholism. This transient lifestyle explained why there were so few official records of her existence. She had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail that might lead authorities back to her childhood home. Veloz also solved the mystery of why Mary had suddenly obtained that Arizona identification card in 2003. She had needed surgery to remove her gallbladder and required state assistance to pay for the procedure. A local nonprofit organization had helped her track down her birth certificate so she could get proper identification in her real name. The Southern accent that had bothered so many people also had a logical explanation. Mary had spent time in various parts of the country during her decades of wandering, and speech patterns can change over time, especially for someone who had been drinking heavily for years. As for that mysterious email Mary had sent to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity, Veloz discovered that Mary had sent a follow-up message trying to clarify her meaning. She explained that she had been confused and wasn't sure what she was trying to say in the original email. This was consistent with someone struggling with severe alcoholism and the cognitive effects of long-term substance abuse. The smoking gun in Veloz's investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Maury Kimmel's relatives had kept a photograph of Mary, taken at least a year after her alleged murder in 1981. This picture clearly showed Mary as a teenager, alive and well, long after she was supposed to have been killed. Veloz submitted this photograph to TrueFace, a state-of-the-art facial recognition company. Their algorithms compared the teenage Mary in the photograph with later pictures of Phoenix Mary, and the results were conclusive. There was a 99% probability that they were the same person. With this evidence in hand, Veloz submitted her final report and officially closed the Mary Day investigation for good. After decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was finally resolved. Mary Louise Day had not been murdered in 1981. She had run away from an abusive home and spent the rest of her life trying to survive on her own terms. 9 days after Velaz interviewed her, Mary Day died from cancer. There was no funeral. The woman who had been at the center of one of California's most bizarre missing person cases passed away quietly. Her story finally told, but even with the case officially closed, some people remained unconvinced. Mark Clark, the retired detective who had developed the imposter theory, admitted that Velaz's report made him question his own investigation, but he couldn't entirely shake his suspicions. Steve Cercone, the former police chief, also found himself leaning toward accepting that Phoenix Mary was indeed the real Mary Louise Day after seeing the photographic evidence. But he remained certain that the cadaver dogs had detected something significant at both burial sites. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in the Houle household in 1981. The cadaver dogs don't lie, as their handlers repeatedly insisted. They detected human remains at 2 separate locations where the family had lived. But whose remains were they detecting? Perhaps William Houle was responsible for another death that was never reported. Perhaps there were other victims whose stories have never been told. Or perhaps the dogs were detecting very old remains that had nothing to do with the Houle family at all. What we do know is that Mary Louise Day survived her childhood ordeal and lived for 36 more years after supposedly being murdered. She never had an easy life, but she managed to survive on her own terms, far from the people who had failed to protect her as a child. The Mary Day case serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail vulnerable children. Mary was bounced between foster homes, returned to an abusive household, and disappeared without anyone in authority noticing or caring. For 20 years, not a single official asked where she had gone. It also demonstrates how conspiracy theories can take on a life of their own, especially when they seem to explain mysterious circumstances. The imposter theory was compelling because it accounted for so many odd details, but ultimately it was wrong. In the end, Mary Louise Day's story is not one of murder and cover-up, but of survival against overwhelming odds. A 13-year-old girl found the courage to escape an impossible situation and built a life for herself, however difficult and imperfect it may have been. She deserved better from the adults who were supposed to care for her. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. But she found a way to survive, and that survival was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The mystery of what happened to Mary Day has finally been solved. She lived, she struggled, and she endured. And maybe, in its own way, that's the most important truth of all. The quiet streets of Quincy, Illinois had never seen anything quite like this before. A brutal execution in broad daylight. A mother of 3 gunned down in her own bathroom. And at the center of it all, a game show answer that would echo through a murder trial. This is a story about secrets hidden behind suburban facades, about a marriage that crumbled into something deadly, and about how a single moment on national television can take on an entirely different meaning when viewed through the lens of tragedy. On a cold February morning in 2023, the unthinkable happened in this Mississippi river town where everyone knows everyone. Becky Bleefnick, a beloved nurse and devoted mother, was found dead in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. She had been shot 14 times. 14 times. Each bullet a deliberate act of violence that would shatter not just her family, but an entire community's sense of safety. The crime scene told a story of pure terror. Someone had scaled the outside of her house in the dead of night, pried open a second-story window, and hunted her down like prey. When Becky tried to call for help, her phone was knocked from her hands. She fled to her bathroom, but there was nowhere left to run. The killer stood over her and fired shot after shot until she was gone. But this wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. This wasn't some stranger looking for valuables to steal. This was personal. This was execution. And investigators would soon discover that the answer to who killed Becky Bleefnick might have been hiding in plain sight all along. 4 years before Becky's murder, her husband Tim stood on a brightly lit game show stage, facing host Steve Harvey and a studio full of cheering fans. The question seemed innocent enough. "What's the biggest mistake you made at your wedding without missing a beat?" Tim looked directly into the camera and delivered an answer that would later send chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. "Honey, I love you, but I said I do." The studio audience erupted in laughter. Steve Harvey doubled over. Even Tim's own family members standing beside him broke into grins. It was just a game show moment, a throwaway line meant to get a laugh and maybe win some points. But when those words resurfaced after Becky's brutal murder, they took on a meaning that nobody could have imagined, because by then, Tim Bleefnick was sitting in a jail cell, charged with his wife's murder. The story of Tim and Becky began like so many others. They met as college students at Quincy University, two young people with their whole lives ahead of them. For years, they seemed to have it all figured out. Tim built a successful career in the recycling industry, while Becky devoted herself to raising their 3 young sons. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But perfection, as we all know, is often just an illusion. Behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. Friends and family members would later describe a relationship where control became more important than love, where manipulation replaced partnership. Becky, who had once been content as a stay-at-home mother, began to dream of something more. She wanted to go back to school, to become a nurse, to build a career of her own. Tim wasn't supportive of those dreams. In fact, he seemed threatened by them. When Becky finally did pursue her nursing degree, the tension in their marriage reached a breaking point. She was flourishing in her new role, helping patients and saving lives. But at home, things were falling apart. The woman who had once deferred to her husband's wishes was finding her voice, and Tim didn't like what he was hearing. In January 2021, Tim filed for divorce. But if he thought that would give him back the control he craved, he was wrong. What followed was nearly 2 years of bitter legal battles over money, property, and most importantly, custody of their 3 children. The divorce proceedings revealed just how toxic their relationship had become. Court documents painted a picture of escalating conflict, with both sides hurling accusations. Tim sought a restraining order against Becky, claiming she was harassing him. Becky fired back with her own concerns about Tim's behavior, telling friends and family that she feared for her safety. Most chilling of all was a text message Becky sent to her sister more than a year before her death. "If something ever happens to me, please make sure the #1 person of interest is Tim." It was a message that would prove prophetic in the most tragic way possible. As their divorce dragged on, Becky's fears seemed to intensify. She told friends about hearing voices in her backyard and motion detectors going off at odd hours. Her next-door neighbors had installed a security camera after some car break-ins, and what that camera captured in the weeks leading up to Becky's murder would become crucial evidence. The footage showed a shadowy figure walking down the driveway that ran alongside Becky's house. Not once, but multiple times. Always in the middle of the night. Always when Becky would be home alone with her children sleeping upstairs. Someone was watching her. Someone was learning her routines, her vulnerabilities, her schedule. Someone was planning the night of February 22nd into the early morning hours of February 23rd. 2023, that plan was put into action. While most of Quincy slept peacefully, a killer made their way through the darkness toward Becky's home. They brought with them a crowbar to pry open windows, gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and most importantly, a loaded 9mm handgun. What happened next was captured not by video cameras, but by the cold, hard evidence left behind at the scene. The killer had climbed onto Becky's roof using a patio chair, then moved past several easier entry points to reach a second-story window in one of her children's bedrooms. They pried it open and climbed inside. Becky was in her bedroom when she heard the intrusion. In a moment of pure terror, she managed to dial 911 on her cell phone, but before she could speak to an operator, the phone was knocked from her hands. She ran toward her bathroom, perhaps hoping to lock herself inside, but her attacker was right behind her. The killer fired 14 shots. 14 deliberate, calculated shots that ensured Becky would never leave that bathroom alive. But here's what makes this crime even more chilling. None of those wounds were immediately fatal. Becky lay dying on that cold bathroom floor for minutes, alone and in agony, while her killer calmly walked away. When Becky's father discovered her body hours later, he found a scene that would haunt the investigators for months to come. Shell casings scattered across the floor, pieces of plastic that would later be identified as fragments from grocery store bags. And most telling of all, a partial shoe print that suggested this was no random crime. This was personal. This was planned. And this was about to become one of the most shocking murder cases in Illinois history. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of surveillance videos, DNA evidence, and digital footprints that painted a disturbing picture of obsession and control. It would reveal internet searches for homemade silencers and techniques for cleaning gunpowder off hands. It would expose a fake social media account used to track down information about Becky's new romantic relationships. And at the center of it all would be Tim Bleefnick, the man who had once joked about regretting his marriage on national television, now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars for allegedly ending that marriage in the most violent way imaginable. But Tim maintained his innocence. He had an alibi. He claimed he was home with their 3 children that night, being the devoted father he had always been. The evidence against him was circumstantial. His lawyers argued coincidental, the product of investigators who had rushed to judgment and targeted the most obvious suspect. The question that would consume the small town of Quincy for months was simple, yet profound. Was Tim Bleefnick a grieving ex-husband wrongly accused of a horrific crime? Or was he a calculating killer who had planned the perfect murder? The truth about what happened that night would have to be pieced together from fragments of evidence, digital breadcrumbs, and the testimony of those who knew Tim and Becky best. And as investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that the warning signs had been there all along. Becky's sister Sarah had never trusted Tim completely, but even she was shocked by the brutality of what had happened. When the call came that February morning, she knew immediately who was responsible. It wasn't intuition or guesswork. It was the culmination of months of watching her sister live in fear, of hearing about strange incidents and threatening behavior that had escalated as their divorce proceedings dragged on. The surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Those grainy images of someone walking down the driveway in the dead of night weren't random occurrences. They were reconnaissance missions. Someone was studying Becky's routine, learning when she was most vulnerable, planning the perfect moment to strike. But who was that shadowy figure? The video quality was too poor to make out a face or even determine if it was a man or woman. What investigators could see was someone on a bicycle, riding through the neighborhood at hours when no normal person would be out in the cold Illinois winter. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Every time that figure appeared on camera, it corresponded with other suspicious activity in the area. When police began canvassing the neighborhood for more evidence, they found that bicycle less than half a block from Tim's house. It was a blue Schwinn with no reflectors on the wheels, matching exactly what had been captured on the security footage. But Tim insisted it wasn't his bike, that he'd never seen it before, that its proximity to his home was just another unfortunate coincidence in a case built on circumstantial evidence. His defense team would argue that point repeatedly during the trial. Yes, Tim and Becky had been going through a bitter divorce. Yes, he had made some questionable internet searches. Yes, there were shell casings in his home that matched the murder weapon. But none of that proved he was a killer. It just proved he was a man going through the most difficult period of his life. The prosecution saw things very differently. They believed they were looking at a carefully orchestrated murder carried out by someone who knew Becky's habits intimately. The killer had bypassed multiple easier entry points to climb through a second-story window in a child's bedroom. They knew that particular room would be empty that night because Tim had the children staying with him. Even more damning was the timing. Becky was murdered just 1 week before their divorce case was scheduled to go to trial. Court documents revealed that Becky had been preparing to present testimony about Tim's father that could have been devastating to the family's reputation. She wanted supervised visitation only, citing concerns about the children's safety and well-being. For a man who prosecutors described as obsessed with control and public image, the thought of those allegations becoming public might have been unbearable. They painted a picture of Tim as someone who would rather see Becky dead than allow her to expose family secrets or win custody of their children. The digital evidence told its own story. Tim's phone revealed hundreds of searches related to his ex-wife's new romantic relationship. On Valentine's Day, just a week before the murder, someone had been spotted on the neighbor's security camera while Becky's new boyfriend's truck was parked in her driveway. Within minutes of that sighting, Tim's phone showed extensive searches for that man's license plate number and vehicle identification number. It was the behavior of someone consumed by jealousy and rage. Prosecutors argued, someone who couldn't accept that Becky had moved on with her life while he remained trapped in the past. The murder weapon itself provided perhaps the most compelling evidence. Police found spent shell casings in Tim's home that forensic experts determined had been fired from the same gun used to kill Becky. It was a 9mm handgun that Becky had once given Tim as a gift. Back when their marriage was happy and they still trusted each other completely, when their relationship soured and Becky filed for protection orders, she had specifically requested that Tim return that gun. Court records showed she wanted it back because it was registered in her name, but Tim claimed he no longer had it, that he hadn't seen it in years. According to prosecutors, he was lying. They believed he had kept that gun specifically to use against her when the moment was right. The plastic fragments found at the crime scene told another part of the story. Forensic analysis revealed they came from grocery store bags, the kind every household accumulates over time. But these weren't just random pieces of plastic. They appeared to have been used deliberately, possibly to muffle the sound of gunshots or catch shell casings as they were ejected from the weapon. DNA evidence found on those plastic fragments couldn't definitively prove Tim's guilt, but it couldn't exclude him either. The same was true for genetic material found under Becky's fingernails. She had fought for her life in those final moments, scratching and clawing at her attacker, potentially leaving crucial evidence behind. Tim's defense team, led by attorney Casey Schnook, attacked every piece of evidence methodically, The DNA was inconclusive. The shell casings could have been planted. The internet searches were taken out of context. The bicycle could have belonged to anyone. They painted their client as a devoted father who would never orphan his own children by murdering their mother. But the prosecution had one more card to play. They revealed that on the morning of Becky's murder, hours before her body was discovered, Tim had delivered a children's basketball hoop to his father's house. It was a seemingly innocent gesture that took on sinister implications when viewed through the lens of what they knew about the case. Why would a grieving husband be running errands and making deliveries on the same day his ex-wife lay dead in her bathroom? Unless, of course, he already knew she was never going to be a problem again. The trial that followed would captivate the small town of Quincy and draw national attention. Here was a case that had everything: a brutal murder, a bitter divorce, family secrets, and that haunting game show appearance that seemed to predict the tragedy to come. Tim Bleefnick sat in the defendant's chair, maintaining his innocence even as witness after witness testified about his controlling behavior, his obsessive monitoring of Becky's activities, and his desperate attempts to maintain power over a woman who was finally ready to break free. The jury would have to decide whether they were looking at a cold-blooded killer who had planned the perfect murder, or an innocent man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence and coincidence. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would determine whether Tim spent the rest of his life behind bars or walked free to raise the 3 children who had already lost their mother. When the verdict was read on that May afternoon in 2023, the courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of breathing. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, which in many ways they were. Tim Bleefnick showed no emotion as the judge's gavel came down. His family members in the gallery began to weep. Becky's family finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Justice, they said, had been served. But justice couldn't bring back a mother of 3 who had died alone on a bathroom floor. The sentencing hearing 3 months later would be even more emotional. Becky's sister Sarah stood at the podium and delivered words that cut through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a blade. She spoke directly to Tim, the man she had once considered family, the father of her nephews, the person she now believed had destroyed their lives forever. Your children's future will be forever impacted by your crime, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. They are already suffering. Maybe you should have Googled childhood PTSD between your internet searches for homemade silencers and VIN numbers. It was a devastating moment that captured the true cost of this tragedy. 3 young boys had lost their mother to violence and their father to prison. They would grow up knowing that the 2 people who were supposed to protect them above all else had instead become locked in a battle that ended with one dead and the other condemned to die behind bars. Judge Robert Adrian had the option of sentencing Tim to anywhere between 45 years and life without parole. He chose the harshest penalty available, telling Tim that he had researched the murder, planned it, and executed it with a coldness that demanded the ultimate punishment. You broke into her house and you shot her 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times, the judge said, his voice rising with each number. The court believes that the appropriate sentence would be natural life in prison, life without the possibility of parole. Tim Bleefnick would never see freedom again. He would never attend another of his children's baseball games or school plays. He would never walk them down the aisle at their weddings or hold his grandchildren. The man who had once stood on a game show stage and joked about regretting his marriage would spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, paying for what the jury believed was the ultimate expression of that regret. But even as Tim was led away in shackles, questions remained. His defense team immediately announced plans to appeal, maintaining that their client had been convicted on circumstantial evidence and speculation rather than concrete proof. They argued that the real killer was still out there, that justice had not been served but perverted. The prosecutors disagreed. They believed they had followed the evidence exactly where it led them, building a case piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. The shell casings, the DNA fragments, the surveillance footage, the internet searches, the timing of the murder, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. For the community of Quincy, the trial's end brought a mixture of relief and sadness. The streets were safe again, but the cost had been enormous. A beloved nurse was gone forever. 3 children were orphaned. A family was shattered beyond repair, and the illusion of safety that small towns cherish had been stripped away by the recognition that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. The case would be remembered not just for its brutality, but for the way it revealed how domestic violence can escalate in shadows, how warning signs can be missed or dismissed, and how the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger. Becky's final text message to her sister, the one predicting that if something happened to her, Tim should be the first suspect, became a haunting reminder that victims of domestic abuse often know their fate long before anyone else recognizes the danger. She had tried to protect herself through the legal system, through restraining orders and custody battles, but in the end, the system had failed her when she needed it most. Today, Tim Bleefnick sits in an Illinois maximum security prison, maintaining his innocence and fighting his conviction through the appeals process. His children are being raised by Becky's parents, trying to build new lives from the wreckage of unimaginable tragedy. And somewhere in a television archive, that Family Feud episode still exists. A bizarre time capsule of a moment when a joke about marriage regret seemed harmless and funny, rather than prophetic and chilling. It serves as a reminder that we never really know the people around us as well as we think we do, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments can take on extraordinary significance when viewed through the lens of tragedy. The game show and the murder. 2 seemingly unconnected events that became forever linked in one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent memory. A reminder that truth, as they say, can indeed be stranger than fiction. The summer of 2021 started like any other in Windsor, Wisconsin, a quiet suburb just outside Madison where families barbecued in their backyards and kids played in tree-lined streets. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, a web of lies was about to unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. What began as a routine missing persons report would expose deception so elaborate, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe what they were uncovering. And at the center of it all was a single piece of digital evidence that would change everything. A screenshot from Snapchat that would reveal the darkest family secret this small town had ever seen. This is the story of how social media became the key to solving one of Wisconsin's most disturbing crimes. How a loving couple's disappearance turned into a nightmare that no parent could ever imagine. And how their own son's digital footprint would ultimately lead investigators straight to the truth. My name is speaking to you from the heart of true crime. And what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Because sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones capable of the unthinkable. The Halderson family seemed to have it all figured out. Bart and Krista had built a beautiful life together in their Windsor home, complete with everything a middle-class American family could want. 2 sons they adored, stable careers, and a cherished family cabin up north where they could escape the pressures of everyday life. Bart worked as a managing director for an international accounting firm, the kind of guy who wore pressed shirts and kept detailed schedules. Krista balanced him perfectly as the nurturing heart of the family, working in customer service at an auto body shop while pursuing her love of art projects in her spare time. Together, they were the picture of suburban success. Their oldest son, Mitchell, had landed a job in tech and was building his own future. But it was their youngest, 23-year-old Chandler, who seemed to be on the most promising path of all. Still living at home while finishing college, he talked constantly about his internship at an insurance company and couldn't contain his excitement about landing what he claimed was his dream job at SpaceX. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, as it would turn out. Friday morning, July 2nd, 2021. Dan Croninger arrived at Zimbrick Body Shop expecting to see his friend and co-worker Krista at her usual spot. But her desk was empty, her computer was off, and there was no note, no message, no explanation for her absence. For anyone else, this might not have raised immediate alarm bells. People call in sick. Emergencies happen. But Dan knew Krista better than most. In all the time they'd worked together, she had never simply failed to show up without calling. It wasn't in her nature to leave people hanging, especially not the customers who depended on her. When his calls went straight to voicemail and his text messages remained unanswered, Dan's concern began to grow. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut that afternoon, unable to shake his worry. Dan made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He drove to the Halderson home with his girlfriend, determined to check on his friend. The neighborhood was quiet, exactly as you'd expect on a summer afternoon in Windsor. Manicured lawns, white picket fences, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. When they knocked on the front door, silence greeted them. Dan peered through the window and noticed something odd. A coffee table had been knocked over near the fireplace, lying on its side like furniture displaced during some kind of struggle. But maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just bumped into it. Walking around to the garage, Dan's confusion deepened. Both of Bart and Krista's cars were sitting in their usual spots. If they had gone somewhere, how did they get there? He was beginning to circle around to the back of the house when the side door opened. Chandler emerged, wrapped in a towel, his hair wet from what he claimed was a recent shower. There was something in his demeanor that struck Dan as off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was just the shock of the situation. When Dan asked about his parents, Chandler had an immediate explanation. There had been an emergency at the family cabin up north, he said. His mom and dad had to leave suddenly that morning to deal with whatever crisis had emerged. It made sense, Dan supposed. These things happened with vacation properties, but as the days passed, Dan's relief began to transform back into concern. Chandler explained that cell service was spotty at the cabin, that his parents would only be able to communicate when atmospheric conditions were just right. It was a reasonable explanation for a remote location in northern Wisconsin. Sunday, July 4th. Chandler called Dan, complaining of boredom and asking if there was anything to do. Dan invited him over to watch fireworks, and during their conversation, asked about Bart and Krista. Chandler mentioned that he'd spoken with them, and they planned to return Monday. The detail was reassuring, even if something about the whole situation still felt slightly off. Monday came and went, with no sign of Krista at work. Tuesday brought more of the same. By Wednesday, July 7th, Dan's concern had transformed into genuine alarm. Krista had missed an important doctor's appointment that she'd been looking forward to, one that had already been rescheduled once. This wasn't like her at all. That morning, Dan pushed Chandler to do what needed to be done: file a missing persons report, get the authorities involved, find out what had happened to two people who had seemingly vanished without a trace. When Chandler Halderson walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office that Wednesday morning, he appeared to be nothing more than a concerned son desperate for answers about his missing parents. He told investigators that Bart and Krista had left Thursday morning with another couple to spend the long weekend at the family cabin in Langlade County, about 3 hours north of Windsor. Detectives Sabrina Sims and Brian Shunk were assigned to lead the investigation. As they began gathering information, several details immediately stood out as unusual. Neither Bart nor Krista had mentioned to co-workers or friends that they were planning a trip. Their older son, Mitchell, had no knowledge of any weekend plans. And perhaps most puzzling of all, no one seemed to know who this mysterious other couple was supposed to be. The family cabin held special significance for the Haldersons. Built by Krista's grandparents in the 1940s, it was a rustic retreat on a remote lake where the family had created decades of memories. It was exactly the kind of place where cell phone service might be unreliable, where people could disappear from the digital world for days at a time. But as investigators began reaching out to friends and family members, they discovered something troubling. Despite Chandler's claims that his parents had been planning this trip, no one else had heard anything about it. Not their co-workers, not their extended family, not even Mitchell. The day after the missing persons report was filed, Mitchell and his fiancée made the 3-hour drive north to the family cabin. They met with deputies from the Langlade County Sheriff's Office, hoping against hope that they would find some sign of Bart and Krista, some indication that they had been there, even if they had since moved on to another location. What they found instead was an empty cabin that clearly hadn't been occupied in weeks. The canoe sat unused in its storage shed. Dust had settled on surfaces that should have shown signs of recent activity. It was obvious that no one had been to the property in a very long time. While Mitchell was searching the cabin, Chandler was back in Windsor, going door to door through the neighborhood. Security cameras captured him moving from house to house, asking neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a devoted son desperately trying to find his missing parents. But investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in Chandler's story. Small details that didn't quite add up. Questions that seemed to have different answers depending on when they were asked. And then they received a tip that would change the entire direction of their investigation. A local farm owner contacted the sheriff's office with information about Chandler Halderson. She was a friend of his girlfriend, Kat, and she told detectives that she had seen Chandler at her property over the 4th of July weekend. But more importantly, she had seen him return alone the following day, July 5th, when his car was parked backed up to a field near her woodline. This was the first time anyone had mentioned Chandler being anywhere other than home during the time his parents were supposedly missing. And when detectives asked him about it directly, he had never mentioned visiting this farm at all. The discovery would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything Chandler Halderson had been trying to hide. Because sometimes, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. The farm where deputies were now searching belonged to someone connected to Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine Melander, who went by Kat. As investigators combed through the rural property, looking for any sign of what Chandler might have been doing there alone, they made a discovery that would forever change the trajectory of this case. Hidden among the tall grass and scattered debris, deputies found human remains. Not a complete body, but but a male torso that had been carefully concealed with sticks and twigs. The grass around the area had been matted down, creating a clear trail that led directly to the grisly discovery. Detective Sims would later describe it as unlike anything she had encountered in her career. Most death investigations involve intact victims, crime scenes that tell a coherent story. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to a level of violence and calculated disposal that chilled even experienced investigators to their core. The discovery of the remains triggered an immediate shift in the investigation. What had begun as a missing persons case was now clearly a homicide, and the timing couldn't be ignored. Here was evidence of violence found at a location where Chandler Halderson had been seen alone, just days after his parents had supposedly left for their cabin trip. When detectives brought Chandler back to the station for questioning, the tone of their conversation was markedly different. They couldn't reveal exactly what they had found, but they made it clear that his story was falling apart. They knew he wasn't telling them the truth, and they needed him to explain what had really happened. But Chandler wasn't ready to break. Instead, he did what many suspects do when confronted with evidence they can't explain. He asked for a lawyer. The interview was over before investigators could get the answers they desperately needed. Within days, DNA testing confirmed what detectives already suspected. The remains found on the farm belonged to Bart Halderson. The preliminary autopsy results revealed that he had been shot at least twice in the back. This wasn't an accident or a moment of passion. Someone had executed Bart Halderson with cold precision. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Windsor community. A loving father and husband had been murdered and dismembered, his body parts scattered and hidden like refuse. And the person who had reported him missing, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for help finding him, was now the prime suspect. Chandler was arrested and charged with providing false information to law enforcement. It was a holding charge while investigators built their murder case, but there was still one terrifying question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Where was Krista Halderson? The discovery of Bart's remains had answered one question while creating an even more urgent one. If Chandler had killed his father, what had happened to his mother? Was she still alive somewhere? Possibly being held against her will, or had she met the same fate as her husband? Time was critical. If Krista was still alive, every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding her. But if she was dead, investigators needed to locate her remains before evidence deteriorated further. The summer heat and natural decomposition were working against them. This is where Catherine Mellender's cooperation became absolutely crucial to the investigation. Kat had been dating Chandler for some time, and their relationship had been marked by infidelity and deception on his part. She had caught him cheating before, had confronted him about his lies, and had grown suspicious of his behavior. In response to her distrust, Kat had convinced Chandler to share his location with her through Snapchat. The popular social media app allows users to see where their friends are in real time, creating a digital trail of movement and activity. For Kat, it was a way to keep tabs on a boyfriend she no longer fully trusted. For investigators, it would prove to be the key to everything. When detectives asked for permission to download information from Kat's phone, she agreed without hesitation. She wanted to help find Bart and Krista, and she was beginning to suspect that her boyfriend might know more than he was telling anyone. What they found in Kat's phone records was a treasure trove of digital evidence. Not just location data, but timestamps, messages, and most importantly, a screenshot that Kat had saved during the crucial time period when the murders were believed to have occurred. The screenshot showed Chandler's Snapchat avatar positioned near the Wisconsin River. approximately 25 miles from his family home. The timestamp indicated it was taken on the morning of July 1st, and Kat had saved the image because she found his location suspicious. Why would her boyfriend be out in such a remote area so early in the morning? For investigators, this single piece of digital evidence was like finding a smoking gun. Here was proof that Chandler had been at a specific location during the time frame when his parents were supposedly leaving for their cabin trip. A location that was nowhere near his home, nowhere near any legitimate reason for him to be there. The area near the Wisconsin River where Chandler's phone had pinged was dense with woodland and difficult terrain. It was exactly the kind of place someone might go if they needed to dispose of evidence without being seen. The kind of place where human remains could be hidden and might never be found without a specific reason to search there. Law enforcement teams from throughout Dane County converged on the area, using the Snapchat data as their starting point. They began a methodical search of the wooded region along the riverbank. The vegetation was thick, the summer growth making visibility limited and progress slow. Chandler had been to this area before. A photograph from the previous year showed him at the same location, holding a large knife and smiling for the camera. It was the kind of outdoorsy photo that many young men post on social media. But in the context of the current investigation, it took on a much darker significance. The search teams worked for hours, covering ground methodically and carefully documenting anything they found. The area was remote enough that evidence could have remained undisturbed for weeks, but the July heat and humidity were working against preservation. When they finally made the discovery they had been dreading, it confirmed their worst fears, hidden in the dense underbrush. Searchers found human remains that had been dismembered and scattered, 2 legs, cut into different sections, concealed among the vegetation like discarded waste. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to Krista Halderson, the loving mother and wife who had failed to show up for work that Friday morning, had met the same brutal fate as her husband, the young man who had reported his parents missing, who had appeared on local news pleading for help in finding them, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for any information about their whereabouts, had been the one responsible for their deaths all along. But the question that would drive the prosecution's case was still unanswered. What could possibly motivate a son to murder both of his parents in such a calculated and brutal manner? The answer, investigators would discover, lay in a web of lies so complex and elaborate that it had taken months to construct. Chandler Halderson had been living a completely fabricated life, telling everyone around him stories about academic success, professional opportunities, and future prospects that existed only in his imagination. And when that carefully constructed fantasy began to crumble, when the truth threatened to expose him, he had chosen the most unthinkable solution possible. The digital evidence that would ultimately convict him came from the very technology he had grown up with. Social media apps designed to connect people and share experiences had instead created an unbreakable chain of evidence that led directly to his doorstep.